Pop quiz, name that superhero. So he's from New York, he's spider themed, he wears a red suit, he crawls up walls, he's got web shooters, he's got a special sixth sense that alerts him to danger, he spins a web any size, catches thieves just like flies. That's right, it's Jerry Siegel's The Spider. Yeah, the guy who invented Superman wrote a Spider-Man ripoff. The Spider first appeared in 1965 in Lion, the king of boys comics from publisher Fleetway. This comic comes from a time when there were loads of British anthology boys comics. Not just the Beano and the Dandy, but like Buster, Eagle, Vulcan, Thunder, Smash. All of these comics were roughly the same. They're all about kind of 10 stories per comic, each story taking up about 2 pages each. There'd be a kind of a mix of different types of stories. So you'd have humor stories, spy stories, war, westerns, sci-fi. There was a big mix of stuff that you could get, but one thing we didn't really get a lot of was superhero comics. And it kind of blows my mind that the creator of the most well-known superhero in history also wrote this strange little Spider-Man ripoff for a relatively obscure British comic. I'm sure you know like the whole story about the creation of Superman by Siegel and Schuster and so on. If you don't know that, then there are some really good videos right here on YouTube about it, or you can read Superboys by Brad Ricker. This is a really good book about that exact story really, and about those two. But the cliff notes really are that at some point in the 1930s, Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster created Superman. They then sold that character to National Comics for $130. National then went on to go and make about 11 squillion quid out of the most popular pop culture character of all time. And, you know, Siegel thought maybe that he and Joe Shuster deserved a bit of that money. So they decided they were going to sue National for not just money, but also control over the character that they had created. And they got fired for it. This was a very, very bad move for both of them. It pretty much destroyed their careers. They then spent about the next 25 years basically jobbing, just getting whatever work they could get. Where it gets interesting for Siegel, though, is at some point he actually got a job working at Marvel Comics. And at this point, this is like the early 60s, so he'd been in the game for about 30 years at this point. And, you know, he was a well-respected figure, don't get me wrong, but Marvel weren't exactly hurting for talent in the 1960s, you know. So I think there is an element really of Stan Lee essentially, I don't want to say charity, but like helping someone out, you know, like extending a little bit of empathy for a guy who, you know, perhaps was a bit hard up. Siegel didn't do a lot of work at Marvel, but what I think is really interesting is I think while he was there, he was given a vision really of where comics were going. He was surrounded by, you know, your Jack Kirby's, your Steve Ditko's, your Stan Lee's. And I think he saw the early days of that Marvel method, and I think it really gave him a shot in the arm, but also just it told him the direction of travel that comics were going to go in. And so from here, he wrote the Owl for Gold Key. He wrote the Flyman for Archie Comics, who's a superhero themed around a fly. And most interestingly, a character called the Web. The Web was a crime fighter with a spider-themed super suit full of gadgets that he used to fight crime. And then the story goes that at some point in 1965, Jerry Siegel finds an issue of Lion, which is a boys' comic from England. There's no real consensus as to how or where he found this comic. Some say it was in Manhattan, but like I don't think it was for sale in America. But ultimately, the comic lands in his hands. He sees this character called the Spider and went, I could write that with my eyes closed. This is classic Siegel ego, but also maybe this was like an opportunity to start again, to get involved with something new and interesting. Either way, he writes a letter to Fleetway and says, I want to write, and who in their right mind is going to turn down the creator of Superman? I'm sure you noticed, I just said that Siegel saw the spider in an issue of Lion. He did not create the spider. Ted Cowan created the spider, and he wrote like 28 strips of this character for Lion before Siegel joined on. This video is about Jerry Siegel, but also, huge shout out to Reg Bunn. This was the consistent artist for the spider. He wrote every issue, and this is just amazing art. I just think this is bloody fantastic. Bunn was called the Crosshatch King apparently in his day, and I can see why. This artwork is just so good, so detailed. I just love this 60s pen work. Whenever I've looked at older comics, I'm always just blown away by the quality of this work. And I've mentioned this kind of thing before when talking about old comics. It just feels to me that he's just punching way, way higher than was probably necessary for a comic like this. And if I'm honest, I think this art is actually miles ahead of where American comics were in the 60s.
British tradition always, not always, but at least back then, it very much tended to be beautiful artwork, detailed, very well thought through, everything needs to be shown in the panel, everything is so intense and dense, which is incredible. Proper craftsmanship. I don't know how those people did it, how it was physically possible.
There's no origin story. We are just jumping straight into the middle of this. First thing I notice, I think, is this absolutely mad design for the character. He's got this strange Dracula-like appearance, He's got the widow's peak, the slick back hair, the pointy ears. Sometimes he's drawn with fangs, the elf shoes. All of it is just so strange.
It's just the type of the face that to me is especially kind of enjoyable to draw. It's kind of elongated, evil features. You can do heavy on link stuff. Just it's sleek hair. That was yes.
And the first thing we notice about the spider is he's not a hero. He's a villain. He is looking to establish a syndicate of crime because he aspires to be the world's greatest criminal. Right from the first issue, we see him recruiting/abducting criminals and taking them back to his lair, which, by the way, is a Scottish castle that he had moved to upstate New York, brick by brick. Doesn't provide an explanation as to why. That's just where he lives. And the first two characters that we're introduced to are Ordini, the safecracker, and Professor Pelham, the mad professor. These are really his closest two allies throughout the entire run of the comic. They put together, a bank robbery here, a diamond heist there, your classic, criminal capers. I would say that this is probably enough to make a pretty decent crime comic. This could be a good character just with the robberies. But then we're also adding in wall climbing abilities, super strength, agility, super reflexes, and all that kind of stuff. And then the characters are zipping around in Pelham's helicar, which is this glass tube with a helicopter blade on the top that they zip around New York on. And then he's also got his web shooter and his gas gun as well. There's so much going on. And I think it just gives it such a unique feel, right? It just gives it such an edge. And it just makes you want to read more because you just want to find out how weird this is going to get. And it gets really weird. First impressions, what makes the spider so cool is the fact that he's a villain. He does catch thieves just like flies, which is something that you literally never see Spider-Man doing, so that he's got one up on Spider-Man for that. But the reason he catches thieves just like flies isn't to give them to the police to be a good citizen, it's because he wants to get to the goods first. He wants to thin out his competition, which is just such a great little conceit. I think that's brilliant. Cowan then starts experimenting with colourful supervillains rather than kind of run-of-the-mill robbers and so on. And then the Spider is taking them on and, trying to topple their organisation so that he can thin out his competition. I love the fact there's no altruism here. In fact, there doesn't seem to be any heroes at all in the Spider's world. It's just all villains fighting each other. Siegel took over writing from January 1966. From this issue. At first, he isn't really rocking the boat. He's pretty much just continuing what Cowan laid down. The Spider's like escaping from the coppers, and he's always got some silly, convoluted and conceited escape plans that you're expected to believe he'd already put this plan into motion before leaving home. But Siegel really starts kind of flexing his storytelling muscles and making this book his own within a very short period of time. I'm thinking here that this actually might be a bit of a turning point for British comics. You've got like your classic British comics characters like Dan Dare or Janus Stark or the Steel Claw. And none of these characters were superheroes. They were extraordinary people, yes, but they were still like regular people. They had like regular jobs. They were pilots or spies or, race car drivers, stuff like that. But I think that Siegel here, like coming to British comics, coming over from America with that eye for American comics. And yeah, I'm just thinking it's possible that maybe he brought some of that Marvel method with him. He starts moving the focus off of the Spider fighting cops, and he starts really leaning into the idea of him fighting these big, colourful supervillains. And by June of 1966, Siegel started being credited as the creator of the Spider. Siegel sets about creating a wild little rogues gallery for the Spider. We've got Dr. Mysterioso, who is this villain who uses all these incredible inventions. Then there's the Android Emperor, who builds all these like crazy robots. And all of this stuff is just to like rob banks and commit crimes. And the Spider just hates them all. Like he just hates them by virtue of them existing. Because they might get to the diamonds before him, I guess. I don't know. It's all very coy. Siegel really leans into this, like, you activated my trap card kind of malarkey that I mentioned before. You thought you'd got me, but it was actually a decoy and a mask. Or, you thought you'd got me, but it was actually a robot. Although we've never established that I have either the technology or the understanding of how to build and program a robot. It was a robot that looked like me, nonetheless. I started calling this stuff Spider Ex Machina because it happens that much. We're a few minutes into the video, and I appreciate that the clickbait title has probably kind of run its course now. There are some definite differences between Spider-Man and the Spider. He's not a kid, for a start. He doesn't thwip around New York City on his webs. He flies around in Professor Pelham's helicar. He doesn't live with his old aunt. He lives with his mates in his castle. So I think really for probably every single thing where the Spider feels similar to Spider-Man, there's probably at least one thing where he's not the same. I'm not really sure how much of a Spider-Man crib this comic really started out as, but when Siegel got involved, he added spider senses, and then, whether intentionally or not, took this comic in a far more Spider-Man coded direction. Was it conscious? Was it subconscious? I don't know, but I feel like that brief stint at Marvel had a pretty profound effect on Siegel, and I think we're seeing that here.
That's a good theory potentially, now you said it, I kind of see how this could potentially be connected. You never know. All of it, this, the web ability, the costume, obviously not so much with the current version, but back then, the costume was obviously, the Spider-Man was less elaborate. There was this one story when there was this kind of almost like a king who was he was so powerful, but it almost kind of looked like a kingpin, but set in medieval times or something like that. Was there? it's a good theory. You know, yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if there's a link there for sure.
What I can't do is talk exhaustively about every story from the Spider. There's absolutely loads of it. So I'm really only going to talk about the stories which I liked the most or had the biggest impact on me. And I think the first story I'd like to talk about is the Spider versus the Exterminator. And the reason I think I'd like to talk about this is because this is where the comic starts getting like really stupid, but in the best possible way. Because the Exterminator is essentially the opposite version of the Spider. He's hired by Crime Incorporated or whatever to go after the Spider and to catch him. And he is exactly the same as Spider. He is always thinking 2 steps ahead. So each time the Spider has an escape plan, the Exterminator's thought of it and has put something in the way. So he's kind of like Moriarty to Spider's Holmes, in that, you know that bit in the Guy Ritchie movie where they're both like trying to outthink each other in that final fight. It's like that. And Siegel's writing is really hinged on all those silly conceits about the Spider being 1 step ahead all the time. So this feels like, I don't know, like really meta-textual. Like it feels like quite cutting edge, you know. He's being quite ironic with his own work. There's loads of interesting stuff from the time as well. Like it's a 60s comic, so there's loads of rays and beams. Everything is rays. There's like a beam that comes out of a ring, or there's a ray that comes out of like a headband, or there's a thing on the wall that emits a beam. Like everything's beams and rays. It's hilarious. But this is a post-atomic time period. Marvel were doing the same thing with radiation. Like this was very, very current. So I think it's cool to see it. What's really great about the Exterminator arc is about the same time as the readers twig, the characters figure out that this is going to go on indefinitely because there's an unstoppable force is meeting an immovable object. And so Siegel gives us the only logical conclusion to this kind of story, and they team up. The Exterminator quits his employer and joins the Spider's syndicate of crime, and together they start doing numbers. By the time we get to the Crook from Space, which is the next arc I want to talk about, Siegel had essentially face-turned the Spider and turned him into a full-on hero. He'd left behind the life of crime and he was now trying to start anew and be a goodie. We see, so the Exterminator, who is a professional criminal and doesn't want to reform, he has to go bye-bye. And what's so good about this is the exchange between the Spider and the Exterminator is so cordial about them going their separate ways. It just makes the whole thing really, really funny. And then what the Spider then does to the Exterminator is just really cruel.
Everybody betrayed me. I'm fed up with this world.
The Crook from Space is a strip I actually want to talk about at length. It's going to be the only kind of story that I talk about at length because it's my favourite story of all the ones I've read so far. It is the most unhinged comic I think I've probably ever read. It is just so funny. So the Crook from Space is a shape-shifting alien who looks kind of like a kind of lizard horse vibe. And he can turn into anything, and he just comes down to Earth literally just to cause chaos. I don't think he's even got a goal. And the first thing he does is he turns into a giant version of Jesse James, the cowboy. And he stands one leg either side of a railway track, and he like holds up a train. But because he's giant, he literally holds up the train. The Spider turns up. They exchange some like wordy insults. They have a fight. The Spider convinces him to shrink himself down to fight like a man. Then they have a fist fight. The cowboy grows springs on his hands and feet, bounces away, turns into a horse with a human face, and then flies back to his spaceship. Like, see you later. That's it. Issue 2, he then turns into, I want to say it's Attila the Hun, or maybe it's Mongols. He turns himself into, I think it's 50 versions of Attila the Hun. And he's just riding around on horseback, just causing mayhem, just being a jerk. Then he turns into a giant alien beast to smash stuff up. Then he turns into Hercules, and he's running around like New York City as a giant Hercules. And then people see him, they're like, wow, look at that, it's Hercules, can you believe it? And then Hercules like picks up a statue and just like it into a pond, and everyone's like, oh my god, I can't believe Hercules would do this. And like each time the spider turns up, foils him a bit, but not enough, and then he just sort of like runs back to his spaceship, and then he comes back down again. And then what's a bit weird, is the next form he decides to take is Scarface Al O'Brien, the famous gangster, who is not a real gangster. Don't know why they didn't use real gangsters' names. So he just kind of makes up a, like a vaguely Al Capone type mobster character, but he's got a gun that fires bubbles, and the bubbles make you do whatever he tells you to do. So then, of course, he's getting up to hijinks. Then he turns the spider giant and then shoots him with the bubble gun. Then the giant spider grabs the helicar with his pals in it, and he throws it into the sea. While it's in the sea, it is then dragged to the seabed by a squid, where on the seabed it is set upon by merfolk, presumably from like the lost city of Atlantis. This then triggers them attacking the surface world because they're sick of having to deal with all those surface dwellers all the time. And this latest infraction is just the last straw. So then the story completely, for a second, just stops being about the crook from space and actually becomes about solving like a war with the merfolk. And then once they're back on the surface, the story sort of continues to be about the spider fighting the crook from space in like ever escalating silliness, until eventually he turns into a giant bullet, and he's like, I'm gonna run at you, and it'll be like being shot because I'm a giant living bullet. And then absolutely out of nowhere, Dr. Mysterioso, who I mentioned early on, like one of the very first villains, Siegel brings him back and says, I've been living in a subatomic realm this entire time. Behold, my dinosaur army. And this lasts, I kid you not, for one page before the crook from space figures out how to shrink him back down into his subatomic realm. And that's him gone again. Much more time spent on the merfolk than on this. And it just keeps escalating. There's robots, I think more aliens. Then he takes the form of the spider for a bit, and they, trying to use his own weapons against him. And then like the finale of the story is essentially this kaleidoscopic sequence where the crook from space just almost in every panel is shape-shifting from one thing to another, and they get like just more and more crazy, more and more creative, more and more just out there, and it stops being things you've seen, and it's like, oh, I'm now going to be a dragon man, and you go, okay, that's cool. Now I'm going to be a sun man that can breathe fire. Oh, okay. Now I'm going to be an ice giant. Yep, cool. And then a winged octopus man with hammer-tipped tentacles. And you're like, okay, like you're really just thinking of some stuff, huh, Jerry? At this point, I'm reading this book and I cannot believe it. I'm talking to my partner Lottie about this comic, and I'm struggling to sound like I'm being serious. She's like, you're joking, this isn't happening. I'm like, this, literally every issue, something else completely mad is happening. I've never read a comic like this. And then the whole big finale is eventually the spider's like, it's kind of like the end of Ghostbusters, where he's like, you can choose your destructor. And the spider's like, oh, it would be terrible if you were to turn yourself into a giant snake. And so the crook's like, that's exactly what I'll do. I'm going to turn myself into an enormous snake. And I'm going to, I'll constrict you and swallow you whole. And then out of nowhere, the spider's then got a boomerang, and he throws this boomerang at the snake. The boomerang like shatters over the snake, and it like splashes this chemical on him. And the spider's like, aha, little did you know that behind the scenes, I've been secretly formulating this special chemical that prevents you from shape-shifting. So I chose to get you into your most vulnerable form, threw this glass boomerang at you, filled with this solution that I made, and now you're permanently stuck being a snake. And the crook from space is like, no! And then he picks him up in the helicar, and he flies him to it's like a Arthur Conan Doyle Lost World plateau where there's loads of dinosaurs. It's like the land of Lost. And he just drops in there and he goes, no one will ever find you here on this secret dinosaur island. And that's the end of the strip. That's honestly like 50 comics. That's like a year of reading this story. And the ending is just he drops a snake on an island. You're welcome. So I don't have a lot of criticisms for Jerry Siegel. But one criticism I think I do have is that his stories tended to run on a little bit. The joke starts to wear thin in The Crook from Space after about the 5th thing that he transforms into, and then he just keeps going. And along with that, Siegel's also really wordy. I think this is a kind of hangover from the newspaper strips of the 1930s where everyone's like talky. And I mean, just look at some of this stuff on these pages. Apparently this is something which Lion editorial were aware of as well. And, you know, comics of this time, you only really had 2 to 4 pages to tell a story. And so you really needed to cram as much in as you could. And Jerry Siegel would just fill pages with words. You know, it's like Siegel was turning the spider into one of those episodes from Dragon Ball Z where like no fighting happens and they just talk for the entire time.
And I have to say it feels pretty good.
So despite all the silliness, Siegel actually continued writing the spider for like another 3 years. Towards the end of the run, the serials were getting even longer and more convoluted. He introduced Spider-Boy, which feels slightly self-referential to, you know, the stuff he suffered through the creation of Superboy. He also introduces a gang of villains called the Sinister Seven, which is so clearly a Spider-Man swipe. And I really think he started digging into that Spider-Man cribbing thing with more and more animal-themed villains. He introduced the ant, the fly, the snake. It all just feels much more Spider-Man-y towards the end. Yeah, so credit where credit's due. 4 years is a really long time for a comic from this era. Most comics would last for like 3 months before just sort of fizzling out. And this survived a merger. I mentioned in the Leopard from Lime Street video that back in these days, if a comic wasn't doing too well, quite often the publisher would just merge 2 different comics together. And, you know, they'd kind of choose half the characters from each that would be carried forward. And the Spider survived when Lion merged with Champion. But unfortunately, nothing lasts forever. Under the auspices of saving money, Lion did actually drop Siegel. This is probably true. Rival comics were coming out all the time and like nibbling at Lion's edges. And you can kind of tell because they started doing a lot more reprints in the comic at this time. There's a lot less original strips. So Siegel was given notice to wrap up his writing and, you know, was quietly exited from the comic. So like a lot of British comic characters from this time period, the Spider didn't really get an opportunity to have a big, like, dramatic finale. But at the very least, he did get the opportunity to have an ending. Most of these characters were just like unceremoniously cancelled. Crucially, and most importantly, the story of the Spider does not end there. The first time the Spider returned was in the 2000 AD action special from 1992, I want to say this is. Now this features 4 classic Fleetway characters being brought back up to speed for a modern 90s audience. And you can see the Spider on the front cover of this comic. The internal story is written by Mark Millar, and it is classic, edgy for no reason Mark Millar garbage. For no reason whatsoever, Mark Millar decides to recontextualize the Spider as a deranged serial killer who like stalks the streets and kills people and puts them into webs. And he's like filed his teeth down, and he's gone like completely psychotic. And it's just fucking dreadful, if I'm honest. But what's good about this is it's cool to see that the spider is still in the consciousness of the creators, and like, you know, people were willing to kind of bring these characters out and give them another run. So there's something good there. Then in 2020, Rebellion's Treasury of British Comics label released a Smash one-shot. Smash was another 60s anthology comic. So they took the name and then they took a bunch of, again, like classic old legacy characters, and they put them into this one-shot. This one's really fun. It's written by Rob Williams, and the art's like John McCree and Mike Spicer. So like real comics royalty working on this, like loads and loads of fun. And it turns out the story in here is a sequel to Albion by Leah Moore, because Leah Moore in Albion, she brought loads of these like legacy characters out as well. Should I have mentioned that first? No, it doesn't matter. But yeah, this is loads of fun. It's completely self-aware. It uses all the Spider Ex Machina. I planted a post-hypnotic suggestion in you years ago, you know, all that kind of stuff. It knows what it is. It's really slick. It's really fast. This was loads of fun. Then in 2023, Treasury did a mini-series bringing Smash back. This time, this is a 3-issue limited run. This is a 3-issue story, all written by Paul Grist, each issue drawn by a different artist because it's set in a different time period. And so each issue has a different art style. The spider is the central character that pulls it all through, but like there's loads of characters in here. There's like Jaina Stark, Jane Bond, the 13th Floor, Cursor to Doom, Adam Eterno. They're crammed in here. And this is lots of fun too. I spoke to Anna Morozova, who was the artist for the 1960s portion of this comic, and one of the things we spoke about was like her story being set in 1967. It's bang in the middle of Siegel's run of the comic, and so kind of it could fit in there as like a missing spider story.
So yeah, it was like an interesting project from the beginning where you could experiment with different approaches. So I thought it would be like awesome to actually try and do it by hand, you know. So I did it all like with pencils, you know, like inks by hand. And I kind of wanted to use like bright colors on the coloring, you know, to make it a bit pop, a bit sisters, pop color stuff.
Rebellion rebooted a ton of other legacy comics characters in 2023 as well when they brought back Monster Fun. I spoke about this when I made a video about the leopard from Lime Street, who is another classic British Spider-Man ripoff. So if this has interested you, I have another video very similar, and you can watch that here. Rawr. Bringing all of this back together into one cohesive whole, the Treasury of British Comics 2024 annual had a story where the spider fought the leopard from Lime Street. And this is just so good. It's set at the Harrogate and District Science Fair, where there's like a team of scientists who have got this machine where they're irradiating spiders, and then what they're saying is, hey, if this irradiated spider bites you, it can transfer all these amazing arachnid powers. And then the best bit is Billy Farmer, who is the leopard from Lime Street. And if you haven't seen that video, then the leopard from Lime Street is about a boy who gets scratched by a radioactive leopard and develops a load of leopard powers. It's literally Spider-Man, but with a leopard instead of a spider. Tons of fun. Go check that video out. But Billy is watching this and he's seeing these irradiated spiders and he thinks, wait a minute, this is my origin story. As if to say, like, this is a rip-off of him. It's class. But anyway, the spider turns up to steal these spiders, but then it turns out the whole thing is a trap. These two scientists are actually two of the spider's villains, and they were just using this to like lure him here. The story actually has a cliffhanger ending. It doesn't have a definitive finish, because I guess the intention was this would then be picked up at a later date. And I really hope we get that story. My two favourite Spider-Man ripoffs, duking it out, mano a mano, spider. I read about 125 issues of the Spider to make this video. That's about 2.5 years of the run. Not counting all the more recent stuff like the Smash miniseries and the 2000 AD Summer Special, just the old stuff. Yeah, I read a lot, but I haven't read everything. I've been reading them in these reprinted format from Rebellion's Treasury of British Comics imprint. I have bought like some older issues as well, just so I could have an understanding of the later parts of Siegel's run. They haven't been reprinted yet. I believe there is a fourth book coming. But if you are interested in this comic, I'll put links in the description as to where you can buy these, because I'm sure you can feel me on this. This has been a real journey. This has been a really fun comic to crack open and talk about. Right, well, that's me wrapping up. I think I've spoken about the Spider for long enough. Thank you so much to all my channel supporters here on YouTube and on Patreon. It's really kind of you to give me a little tip at the end of each month. And a super special shout out to The Crawl and to Smoking Eagle, who support me on the shout out tier. If you want to jump in the Discord, you can see what beers I'm spending your money on this month. Cheers. If you'd like to know more about the Spider, I'll leave a link to Lee's books in the description. If you'd like to know more about Lion, this book, King of Story Papers, is brilliant. This is a fully comprehensive history of the history of Lion. So not just the Spider, but everybody who contributed to it. This has been instrumental in the making of this video. And the other one would be Superboys by Brad Ricker. This is a great story about Siegel and Schuster, their whole lives, the struggles they went through from selling Superman, and just really what their lives were like both before and after DC Comics. Really, really, really good. In fact, it's so good, there's a quote at the end which I think would form the perfect ending to this video. Comic books, for all of their rhapsody, can really be understood only by context, historically, culturally, and personally, over issues and between panels. Something happened before, and something happens after. The same goes for the story of the creators. Once you reach the last panel, there is a real urge to look at both sides, before the beginning and after the end, to try to find some context. Thank you very much for watching all the way to the end, you bloody legend. I will see you in the next upload. Ta-da.